System Coherence. Henry E. Pozzetta, April 2026. First, a pattern that recurs across scales. It usually doesn't begin with a catastrophe. The team still ships. The organization still meets its quarterly numbers. The product still works. By every measure the organization typically watches, the system is functioning. But something has shifted, and the people inside it can feel it before they can name it. Decisions take longer than they should. The same problem surfaces a third time, dressed differently. Commitments get made that nobody quite believes. Meetings produce activity but not direction. The work continues, but the system has stopped meaning what it used to mean. This pattern recurs. I have watched it in 3-person teams, and in organizations of 50,000, it looks the same at every scale, even though the mechanisms differ. A small team loses coherence through interpersonal drift and unclear ownership. A large organization loses it through structural sprawl and signal loss. The surface symptoms are different. The underlying condition is the same. The system has stopped maintaining the conditions that allow its parts to act in concert, and it is now operating on momentum. Momentum can carry a system for a long time. That is part of what makes the pattern hard to see. The cycle time charts still produce numbers. The roadmap still has items on it. People are still working hard, often harder than before. The lagging indicators all look reasonable, and the leading indicators that would expose the drift are usually not the ones being watched. Coherence loss is a leading indicator phenomenon being assessed with lagging indicator instruments. By the time the lagging indicators move, the recovery cost is already much higher than it would have been. The recurrence across scales is the first thing worth saying about this pattern, because most available frameworks treat each scale as its own problem. Team-level frameworks talk about psychological safety and team health. Organizational frameworks talk about strategic alignment and operating models. System-level frameworks talk about complexity and emergence. These are all useful at their own scales, but they obscure something that becomes visible when the same phenomenon is observed at multiple scales simultaneously. The failure mode is the same. A team that has lost coherence and an organization that has lost coherence are doing the same thing in different vocabularies. They are spending energy without producing the conditions that energy is supposed to produce. They are running, but they are no longer running together. Second thing worth saying is that the pattern is diagnosable. It is not a mood, not a culture problem in the loose sense, not something you have to feel your way through. The conditions that produce coherent behavior are observable. They can be assessed against operational evidence, cycle time data, dependency density, decision latency, the frequency with which the same problem returns. The dimensions of coherence are not soft. They are structural conditions whose presence or absence shows up in how work moves and how decisions land. Once those conditions are named, the loss of them can be tracked. The drift can be identified before it becomes obvious, and the highest leverage point of intervention can be located rather than guessed at. What follows is an attempt to name those conditions with enough precision to act on them. The frame is not new. People have been writing about systemic coherence in different vocabularies for a long time. What I want to offer is an operational version, a small set of structural conditions, the patterns that emerge when those conditions weaken, and a way of seeing the loss while it is still recoverable. The work that follows is meant to be used, not just read. Second, what coherence is, and what it isn't. The word coherence gets used loosely in organizational writing, often as a stand-in for whatever the writer feels is missing. That looseness is a problem if the goal is operational. Before naming the conditions that produce coherence, it helps to be specific about what coherence is not, because 3 of the things it is most often confused with are different in ways that matter. Coherence is not efficiency. Efficiency measures the ratio of useful output to input. A highly efficient system minimizes waste against a defined production function. A coherent system may run efficiently or inefficiently, depending on what it is doing, but its coherence is a separate property. A team can be remarkably efficient at producing the wrong thing, or efficient at producing the right thing in a way that erodes the conditions needed to keep producing it. Efficiency is a local optimization metric. Coherence is a structural property of the whole. The two are often in tension. Optimizing efficiency at the level of any single function frequently degrades coherence across functions, because the coordination costs that make the system work get treated as overhead and stripped away. Coherence is not productivity. Productivity measures output per unit of resource over time. A productive system delivers more. It does not necessarily deliver consistently, and it does not necessarily deliver in a way that holds together over time. The productivity literature is full of organizations that posted excellent productivity numbers right up to the point where their coherence collapsed, and the productivity went with it. The signal that a productive system has lost coherence is rarely a drop in productivity. It is a rise in the rework, escalation, and recovery work that the productivity numbers don't account for. By the time productivity itself moves, the underlying condition has been deteriorating for some time. Coherence is not alignment. Alignment is the most common confusion and the most consequential one. Alignment describes a state of agreement, people pointing in the same direction, sharing the same priorities, working toward the same outcomes. A coherent system is usually aligned, but an aligned system is not necessarily coherent. Alignment can be produced by leadership pressure, by cultural conformity, by the suppression of dissent, or by the simple fact that nobody has had time to disagree yet. Coherence is harder. It requires that the alignment hold up under change, that the structures supporting it are maintained, that the feedback loops that would expose misalignment are functioning, and that the system can carry productive tension without breaking. Alignment is a snapshot. Coherence is what produces alignment repeatedly, under varying conditions, without continuous pressure. What coherence is, in operational terms, is the property a system maintains continuously through interaction with its environment. It is not a static state. It is observable as the consistency between four things under change: what the system intends to do, how it is structured to do it, what signals it is reading from its environment, and how it actually behaves. When those four are consistent with each other, the system is coherent. When they drift apart, coherence is being lost. The drift is usually gradual and usually invisible from inside, because each of the four can move independently, and the inconsistencies show up as friction in places that look like ordinary operational problems, decisions that don't stick, priorities that keep shifting, work that has to be redone, commitments that don't hold. The reason coherence is worth treating as its own property rather than as a synonym for alignment or a side effect of good management is that it is produced and lost through specific structural conditions that can be named and assessed. A system does not become coherent by trying harder. It becomes coherent when certain conditions are present, and it loses coherence when those conditions weaken. The conditions are not mysterious, and they are not fundamentally different at different scales. The same small set of structural conditions governs whether a 5-person team holds together, whether a department of 200 holds together, and whether an enterprise of 50,000 holds together. They show up differently at each scale, but the list is the same. Naming that list with enough precision to act on is the work of the next section. Third, the 8 constraints, with operational anchors. A coherent system maintains 8 structural conditions. Each one matters. None alone is enough. The loss of any one of them shows up as a recognizable pattern of operational friction. The list is meant to be exhaustive of the conditions that govern coherence, not exhaustive of everything that matters in a system. Many things matter that are not on the list. These are the 8 that, when weakened, produce the failure pattern described in section I. These 8 map onto the 4-part definition from the previous section. Purpose carries intent. Boundary and coupling carry structure. Signal and feedback carry the system's reading of its environment and itself, integrity, capacity, and learning carry behavior under change. Boundary is the condition that the system knows what work belongs inside it and what does not. It is structural. Ownership, scope, decision rights, interfaces with adjacent systems. The operational evidence is whether work that doesn't belong can be named and declined, whether ownership of an outcome can be located when something goes wrong, and whether boundary changes happen deliberately rather than by drift when scope shifts. A system with weak boundary has work flowing into it that nobody owns and decisions being made by people who don't have the authority to make them. Purpose is the condition that the system has a clear reason for existing, and that the reason is operational rather than ceremonial. It is observable in how trade-offs get resolved. When resources are constrained, a system with strong purpose resolves trade-offs by reference to what it exists to do, and a system with weak purpose resolves them by whoever pushes hardest in the moment. The other evidence is whether non-purpose work can be declined, and whether priorities visibly shift when the purpose is refined. Signal is the condition that the system can distinguish meaningful information from noise. It shows up in whether important problems become visible early, whether metrics reflect operational reality, and whether weak signals get noticed before they become strong ones. A system with weak signal is not short on data. It is usually drowning in data and unable to tell which of it matters. The evidence is the gap between when a problem first becomes detectable and when it actually gets attended to. Capacity is the condition that the system has enough headroom to do its work and absorb variation. The original draft of this essay conflated two different things under this name, and the distinction is worth carrying explicitly. Throughput capacity is the system's ceiling, what it can produce when running at full pace. Load capacity is what the system is currently carrying relative to that ceiling, observable as work in progress, queue depth, and aging work. Coherence depends on the second one, not the first. A system with high throughput capacity and equally high load is fragile. A system with modest throughput capacity and disciplined load is robust. The operational anchor is the ratio of carried load to throughput ceiling, not the ceiling itself. And the leading indicator is the age of work in progress rather than its volume. Feedback is the condition that consequences become visible to the people who can act on them in a usable form within a useful window. It is observable as the lag between an action and the information that would tell you whether it worked, and as whether negative feedback can be raised without disproportionate cost to the person raising it. Feedback differs from signal in direction. Signal is what the system reads from its environment. Feedback is what the system reads from its own actions. Learning is the condition under which feedback changes future behavior rather than being absorbed and forgotten. The original draft treated learning as a structural condition alongside the others, and that is the right call as long as the structural part is named clearly. The structural condition is the presence of mechanisms, retrospectives, decision-to-outcome reviews, embedded improvement work that convert feedback into behavior change. The process of learning happens through those mechanisms. When the mechanisms are absent or symbolic, the system can take in feedback continuously and still not learn. The operational evidence is whether the same problem returns in the same form, and whether lessons exist as documented behavior change rather than as recollections held by individuals. Integrity is the condition that the system's behavior remains consistent with its stated values and commitments under stress. It overlaps with boundary at the edges, but is distinct in what it governs. Boundary governs structural definition, what is inside, what is outside, who owns what. Integrity governs behavioral consistency, whether what the system says it does matches what it actually does when conditions get hard. A system with strong boundary and weak integrity has clear ownership and inconsistent behavior. A system with strong integrity and weak boundary has consistent behavior in a structure that nobody understands. Both are recognizable, and they fail differently. Coupling is the condition under which the system's interdependencies with adjacent systems are managed deliberately rather than allowed to accumulate. It would be tempting to leave this constraint distributed across boundary and signal. That distribution misses what the interdependence tension actually requires. The central tension that produces the need for coherence in the first place is the tension between independence and interdependence. A system has to be self-defined enough to act and connected enough to participate. Boundary covers the self-definition side. Coupling covers the participation side. The operational evidence is whether cross-system dependencies are visible and named, whether dependency churn is low enough that commitments hold, and whether decoupling is treated as an investment rather than an afterthought. This is a different kind of instrument from the team health radars that have populated the agile coaching space, Agility Health Radar, Spotify Squad Health, the various OKR maturity instruments. Those tools assess team experience or maturity practice. They ask the people inside the system how things feel or how mature their practices are against a defined model. The 8 constraints are a different unit of analysis. They name the structural conditions that produce coherent behavior, and they are scored against operational evidence rather than experience. The two kinds of instrument can coexist, and they answer different questions. A team health radar can tell you whether the team is in good shape. A coherence assessment can tell you whether the conditions that allow the team to stay in good shape are present. The 8 constraints describe what coherence is made of when it is intact. The next thing worth saying is what happens when one or more of them weakens, because the failure modes are recognizable and they recur. 4th, patterns of breakdown. When one or more of the 8 constraints weakens, the system does not collapse uniformly. It produces recognizable failure patterns. Each pattern has a characteristic operational signature, a typical cause, and a recognition cue that distinguishes it from the patterns it resembles. 5 patterns cover most of what shows up in practice. Operational overload is the pattern that emerges when capacity load is high and signal quality is degrading. The system is carrying more work in progress than it can metabolize, and the volume is interfering with its ability to read what matters. The operational signature is rising aging work, frequent context switching, and decisions made on stale information. The cause is almost always upstream. Demand is being accepted faster than throughput allows, and the cost is paid in the quality of attention available for the work already in progress. The recognition cue is that people inside the system describe it as busy rather than productive, and the same problem keeps surfacing because nobody has time to address it at the root. Coherence drift is the pattern that emerges when purpose is high but boundary and integrity are low. The system has strong intent and direction but lacks the structural clarity to carry it. Ambition outruns ownership. Decision rights blur. Behavior under pressure stops matching what the system says it stands for. The cause is usually growth or strategic acceleration without proportional investment in the structural conditions that let intent translate into consistent action. The recognition cue is that the system can articulate where it's going more clearly than how it gets there, and that the gap between the two is widening. Feedback collapse is the pattern that emerges when feedback is low, and learning is also low. Consequences are not becoming visible to the people who can act on them, and even when they do, the mechanisms that would convert feedback into behavior change are absent or symbolic. The cause is sometimes the absence of feedback infrastructure, but more often it is the slow erosion of feedback discipline under delivery pressure. Decisions stop being reviewed. Retrospectives become ceremonial. What gives it away is repeated failure in the same form, often described by people inside the system as, "We already know about that," meaning they know it exists, not that they have learned from it. Signal degradation is the pattern that emerges when signal alone is below threshold, independent of the other constraints. The system has lost the ability to distinguish meaningful information from noise. The usual cause is metric proliferation. More dashboards, more reporting, more measures, until the signal-to-noise ratio collapses and important problems no longer surface above the data exhaust. A system in this state has plenty of data and persistently misreads its situation, often discovering important issues through informal channels that bypass the formal measurement infrastructure entirely. Dependency saturation is the pattern that emerges when coupling weakens. Cross-system dependencies have accumulated to the point where teams cannot make reliable commitments because their work is gated on others, and the dependency churn is high enough that what is gated on what keeps changing. The cause is usually not deliberate. Coupling accumulates as a side effect of growth, reorganization, and incremental decision-making, and decoupling work rarely competes successfully against direct delivery work for priority. The recognition cue is that escalations about blocked work increase, and that the same dependencies keep reappearing in different forms. These 5 patterns are not mutually exclusive. In any sufficiently stressed system, more than one fires at once. The diagnostic question is not which pattern is present, but which is dominant, because addressing patterns in the wrong order produces movement without progress. The severity hierarchy answers that question. Each pattern has constraining dimensions whose thresholds it depends on, and severity is the distance below those thresholds that the system actually scores. The pattern furthest below its thresholds is the one putting the most weight on the system's coherence, and it is the one to address first. The ordering is not arbitrary, and it is not the same as which pattern surfaces most visibly. The most visible pattern is often a downstream symptom of a more severe pattern operating upstream. 2 characterizations of the overall profile are worth keeping separate from the diagnostic patterns. Adaptive imbalance describes a profile where the spread between the strongest and weakest dimensions is wide enough that the strengths are actively producing the conditions for the weaknesses. High coherence describes a profile where the floor is high enough that no specific intervention is indicated. These are descriptive characterizations of the radar shape. They are not diagnoses, they don't point at a single intervention, and they don't fit into the severity hierarchy. Reporting them alongside the diagnosis, but distinct from it, preserves the difference between this is what your shape looks like and this is what's wrong. A worked example makes the distinctions concrete. Consider a fast-growing SaaS company past initial product-market fit, expanding rapidly across product areas with strong engineering culture and high-quality talent. The cycle time numbers are reasonable. Most people inside would describe the company as healthy and ambitious. The 8-constraint scorecard tells a different story. Purpose at 4.60 and learning at 4.20 are exceptional. Boundary at 2.40, feedback at 2.20, integrity at 2.60, and coupling at 2.20 are all fragile or below. 5 patterns fire, coherence drift dominates by severity, with local learning, boundary ambiguity, identity strain, and dependency saturation following. The profile shape block flags adaptive imbalance separately. The lowest scoring dimensions are feedback and coupling, but the primary constraint, the anchor of the dominant pattern, is boundary. The highest leverage action is to map ownership and decision rights for the top 3 outcomes that lack clarity. Without the 8 constraint view, the obvious story is growing pains, which is true but operationally useless. With it, the diagnosis is specific. The company's strengths are producing the conditions for its weaknesses, because high intent without structural clarity is generating the dependency density and feedback gaps the profile registers. The intervention is not to dampen the strengths. It is to build the structural conditions that let them produce results instead of fragmentation. The coherence profile tool, available separately, performs this analysis in full and surfaces the severity hierarchy, the firing patterns, and the highest leverage action against an organization's actual scores. The point of the worked example here is not to demonstrate the tool. It is to show what becomes visible when the 8 constraints are scored against operational evidence rather than estimated from impression. Fifth, from diagnosis to intervention to monitoring. A diagnosis is useful to the degree that it points at action, and the tool is built around that point. Naming a pattern is not enough. The 8 constraint scorecard, the firing pattern, the severity hierarchy, all of that work exists to support a single output that I have come to think of as the highest leverage action, the one move given this profile and this dominant pattern that has the largest effect on the system's coherence per unit of effort spent. The highest leverage action is not the only thing to do. It is the first thing to do, and the thing whose execution should be visible, because addressing patterns in the wrong order produces motion without progress. For a system in operational overload, the highest leverage action is making work in progress visible at the most overloaded queue and imposing an explicit limit. For a system in coherence drift, it is mapping ownership and decision rights for the top 3 outcomes that lack clarity. For a system in dependency saturation, it is mapping the top 5 cross-team dependencies, naming their failure modes, and addressing the worst one. Each pattern has its own leverage point, and they are different points. What the diagnosis cannot tell you is how to execute. It locates leverage. It does not script the work. Mapping ownership and decision rights for 3 outcomes is a specific instruction at the level of what to do, and is silent at the level of how to do it well in this particular organization with these particular politics and this particular history. That second level is where coaching and judgment carry the work. The diagnosis sets the target. It does not throw the dart. A diagnosis that tries to do both produces either generic recommendations the organization has already heard, or specific recommendations that don't fit the situation. The discipline is to stop where the leverage is named and let the next level of work proceed from there. The diagnostic instrument has a second limit, worth being explicit about. It operates at human timescales. An assessment is done against evidence the organization can articulate, scored by people who can hold the system in their attention, and reassessed at intervals measured in weeks or quarters. That cadence is appropriate for organizational diagnosis. It is wrong for the underlying signal. By the time a coherence problem is visible to people who can articulate it, the signal has been moving for some time. There is a layer of observability that operates faster than human assessment can, and the 8 constraint diagnosis is not it. The entropy engine is. The engine is a separate body of work with its own technical suite and patents pending that monitors information uncertainty and operational data streams at machine time scales, milliseconds to minutes. It detects acceleration, drift, and divergence in the signal characteristics of work systems before those changes surface in the lagging indicators that human assessors typically read. The instruments do not act on the system. They make the conditions for action visible to people who can. That principle matters, because the failure mode for any observability stack is overreach. The temptation to convert detection into automated response, to let the instrument substitute for the judgment of the people running the system. Coherence is a property maintained through interaction. The instruments make the property visible. The maintenance is still done by the people inside the system, and the work of doing it well is still theirs. Sixth, closing. Coherence is the property that lets a system continue to mean what it does. It is not a goal the system pursues. It is the condition under which the system's pursuit of any goal remains the pursuit of that goal, and not something else that has gradually replaced it. When coherence is lost, the system continues to operate. That is the part that makes the loss hard to see and easy to underestimate. A team that has lost coherence still ships. An organization that has lost coherence still makes its quarterly numbers. A product that has lost coherence still works. The work continues, the metrics continue, the people continue. What is stopped is the consistency between what the system intends, how it is structured, what it reads from its environment, and how it actually behaves. The system is still running. It has just stopped being itself. Cost of that loss is paid eventually, and by the time it is paid in lagging indicators, the recovery is expensive. The window in which the loss is recoverable at low cost is the window in which the loss is least visible. Closing that window is what the work in this essay is for. The coherence profile and the entropy engine are two different ways of seeing the loss while it is still recoverable. The profile sees it structurally, at human timescales, by assessing the 8 conditions that produce coherent behavior. The engine sees it mathematically, at machine timescales, by detecting drift in the signal characteristics of the work. There are different instruments looking at the same phenomenon at different cadences, and they are useful in different ways. What they have in common is the goal: to make the loss visible to the people who can still do something about it. That is the work. The instruments are means.